Okay. So I'm speaking with Kat Irving, who is a human remains conservator for Surgeons Hall. She's been there since 2015 and has been looking after anatomical and pathological museum collections for over 20 years. She studied anatomical science, where she began removing brains and sewing up bodies at the Edinburgh City Mortuary. I'm sure you had some good party stories, or maybe you can't really talk about them, but you did later on. So, following training in the care of wet tissue collections at the Royal College of Surgeons in England, she worked with the preparations of William Hunter at the Hunterian Museum at Glasgow University, where she is now a consultant human remains conservator. Kat is a licensed anatomist and gives regular talks on anatomy and medical history. Hi, Kat, how are you going?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. So tell me, like, what most people wouldn't actually know, what is a human remains conservator?
So, what the body wants to do when it's not living or when it's been removed from a living body, because not everything I work with comes from the dead. Some things are the appendixes that have been removed surgically, the tumors that have been removed, the feet that have been amputated. But tissue, when it's not connected to a living human being, wants to decompose. That's what it will do. And it's the same whether it's bones, whether it's, soft tissue, anything like that, it wants to decompose. And my job is to stop it decomposing.
Just then you mentioned an amputated foot. How do you come to, like, why would an amputated foot come to you?
Well, I mean, this is a question that I asked myself when I started working here, because coming from a collection which was much more about teaching anatomy, you come here and it's just like, why are there so many feet? And obviously, this is a collection from surgeons. And one of the things surgeons do is amputate feet. And particularly, at the beginning of the 19th century, when, surgery was not as advanced as it became, it was often done only in the direst circumstances. And amputations were one of the big things that surgeons were doing. So we have a lot of those things that they were amputating to show what was wrong and why they needed to be amputated.
And so have you got too many feet in your collection?
Well, I don't think there's ever too many, but
Okay.
there are a lot. We have feet that have had gangrene, feet that have had nasty breaks that wouldn't have been treatable, at the beginning of the 19th century, things like that. They tended to come off. And I mean, today, still in the 21st century, gangrenous feet will tend to be amputated. So
So can you explain Surgeons Hall? I mean, it's such a famous and old place. So for people that don't know what it is, can you explain it?
So Surgeons Hall is the museum of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh. And the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh is one of the oldest surgical institutions in the world. It's been around since 1505. So it's been a while, but it didn't start off life with the name the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh. It began as the Incorporation of Barbers and Surgeons. But effectively, it's been around training surgeons and being involved in that for over 500 years now.
I mean, that is just incredible, isn't it, really, when you think about it? I mean, what's the oldest thing in your collection?
Well, in terms of human remains, we have an Egyptian mummy. So that's over 3,000 years old. But really, in terms of human remains to start teaching anatomy from and to understand what was going on surgically, we have things from the late 18th century.
And so how did you get into this job? I mean, it's a pretty unusual job. I don't know many people get to have it as their job title. How did you to it?
I started off, as you said in my biography, my undergraduate degree was in anatomical science. So I had an interest in anatomy. I was a child that I would take my dog for walks and, I would pick up dead animals and I would take them home and dissect them. To be honest, I still do that now. So some things haven't changed. But
How
I
old were
really,
you?
really loved, what
I
was
was
that?
gonna say,
Sorry?
how old were you when you were doing that kind of, like, so from quite a
I
young age?
I must have been sort of 11, 12,
Mm.
about that sort of age. but yeah, I was just fascinated by what things looked like inside, and obviously, you get those lovely schematic drawings that you get taught anatomy from at school, that the lungs are here and the heart is here and the intestines are here. And they are a map, but it's not really what things look like once you get inside the body. It's quite a different experience actually seeing that for real. So I found that really, really fascinating. But I never realized that that was a career choice, looking at this kind of things, unless you want to become a surgeon, which didn't really interest me. And I actually applied to university to do biochemistry. But whilst I was here, I realized that there was this anatomical path. So that was the path that I followed. So that was what my undergraduate degree was. And I went from there into working at the city mortuary, where I had, as you said, I would remove the brains and I would remove the internal organs for the pathologist to examine to establish cause of death. And then I would reconstruct the body afterwards. So that was getting very, very, very hands-on with anatomical understanding. But I'd always had this idea of working in a museum, very romantic idea. I used to spend my time between lectures. At that point, the National Museum of Scotland had this skeleton room, and I would go there between lectures to have a look. And of course, Edinburgh University, where I was studying, has its own anatomical museum, and we would have tutorials in there, and I loved being in there. And if somebody had told 21-year-old me that 20 years later I would get to actually go and physically do work in that museum, I would have been very, very happy. But so I had this idea of what a wonderful place anatomical museums were and how much I would like to work with them. So while I was still studying for my degree, I had emailed all the museums in Scotland which held anatomical collections, going, can I come and work for you? I'll do anything. And I always like to point out that Surgeons Hall never ever replied. But the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow at that point were looking for somebody specifically to work with their anatomical and pathological collections, but there was no one out there with the skills. And they talked to me about it, and I was enthusiastic, and it was really, really nice. They seemed very, very keen. And then I didn't hear anything. And I'd been at the mortuary for about a year when all of a sudden, out of the blue, I got an email going, we've just managed to get grant funding for some work to be done with the collection. And that included sending me off to train at the Royal College of Surgeons down of England. They got Simon Moore, who's one of the world leading experts in fluid preservation, to come to Glasgow to work with me. So that was how I got the skills to work with these kind of collections. And that's now more than 20 years ago. So,
I mean, I've already got 100 questions from what you just said. I mean, so what does your day involve, like as a as conservationist in this area? Like, what do you do?
My days are hugely varied. So some days I'm entirely in a lab, working on changing fluids, stitching up tissue, rehydrating things. Sometimes I'm spending time with skeletons, very, very carefully cleaning them. Sometimes it's purely research-based. One of the things that I'm really trying to do is find out as much as we can about the people that we have in our collections so we can tell their stories. So there's a lot of going through records, making sure that we have as much information out there in the public realm so that researchers who are trying to use collections like ours as part of their research, so that they know that what we have, so that they can find the information they need. There's also facilitating the researchers, so we get people coming here. Most recently we had somebody who was looking at musket ball injuries to try and see what they look like on bone, so that they could then take that into their archaeological research to see if what they were seeing archaeologically is musket ball injuries. So
do you have any musket ball injuries?
Oh, we have a lot of musket ball injuries.
What does it look like? Is it sort of like a particular dent or?
Well, I mean, musket balls they have a much slower velocity than, modern, guns do. So like, modern guns just kind of tear through and come out the other side. Whereas musket balls, because they don't have that velocity, they tend to stop. So you will often get something that's embedded in a bone, or it's been embedded and it's fallen out at some point. So you will often get these kind of very sort of specific craters.
Yeah, right. Wow. Okay. And so,
With, with these almost spider webs of fractures radiating off them sometimes. So
yeah. And so do you, so that the, like, so have you got like a computer system and you know, like which bone is in which drawer that has musket ball injuries, or there's just still a lot of
yes,
question to be, okay.
yeah. There's still, I mean, there's still, we have, in terms of human remains, we have more than 10,000 items of human remains. So that's a lot. So, not everything is as detailed as we would like it to be. And again, it's a constant, you know, trying to get as much information out of various sources that we have, figuring out where those sources are. Some of those are handwritten records going back to the beginning of the 19th century. So, it's the delicacy of looking at those records and also reading the handwriting sometimes. Some of the handwriting is beautiful and very easy to do. Other times you're just like, what?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've got an ancestor who was a barber surgeon from sort of the 1500s in England,
Oh,
actually.
wow.
His name's William Clews, and he wrote books, actually. He wrote a book on, because I know you gave a talk recently on syphilis, and he actually wrote a very early book on syphilis that might,
Oh, wow.
but I
Yeah.
can't read the text, like it's in Old English. And
Mm.
interesting, when I was working on the book too, a lot of the old running writing, my mother can read it, so she was interpreting wills, old British wills, and because I was sort of trying to find examples of early body donors. It is a hard thing, isn't it? That handwriting.
Yeah. I
Uh,
think it's a skill. The people that I know that can do it, I have so much admiration because, sometimes, as I said, sometimes the handwriting is lovely and you just go, of course, this is fine. And other times, no.
I mean, so you've got some pretty important, people or body parts in your collection. Who are sort of some of the stars in a way?
It's a sort of, I mean, it's a really interesting thing, um, thinking of it that way because, in terms of important people, when you start thinking about, like we have the knee from General Dresden, who was at the Battle of Borodino. And, so he's a sort of named figure that we can, with a historical record. But a lot of the time, the fascinating thing about this collection is the fact that many of the people who've ended up here tend to be the poorer people in society whose stories don't get told. So it's the fact that you can look at them and you can look at their remains and you can learn about them. And I find that endlessly fascinating. The fact that it feels like I'm getting to spend time with the ordinary people from 100, 150, 200 years ago.
So your collection has quite good details on most of the body parts, or
It varies hugely. Some people we have a lot of information about, others nothing at all, or nothing that we found yet. So it's again, constantly trying to just dig into the records that we have and see what we can find that we can, enhance the biographies of the remains that we have.
I mean, it's a very interesting thing. I spoke to Dominic, who works at the Anatomical Museum at Harvard, that's sort of now behind closed doors, and they've got the skull of
Mm.
Phineas Gage, the man who had
Yeah,
the thing
the
through his
big,
head.
the big
And
hole. Yeah.
it was very interesting talking to curators around the world about the complexities of, what makes a person. Like, so do you tell the story of these people or do you keep it private? Like, if you have an appendix on display, is that a person and can you tell their story? So some of the curators I spoke to had a lot of tensions around, um, how much can you tell and what should you not tell? I mean, where do you sit on that, or is it sort of case by case, or?
I mean, there's definitely sort of case by case thing. I mean, certainly, we would not be telling those personal stories from more modern remains where there may still be, living descendants who may have, may not want those stories told. In some cases, if you have an appendix that was removed in the 60s, that person may still be around, so we would not be going into those kind of cases. In terms of talking about stories, but trying to go back to the 19th century, the 18th century, and get kind of understanding of people's lives, so that we can get snapshots of who people were and what was going on in Edinburgh at that time, amongst the ordinary people.
So what is it, sort of just in terms of their nutrition, like you can tell from their bones, or is it sort of, I mean, I guess a lot of these people were anatomized and then their body parts were preserved for certain reasons. What sort of stories can you tell from, I mean, from a skeleton or different organs that might be preserved?
Well, I mean, for example, one of the ones that I was looking at recently, again, coming from the first half of the 19th century, and it was somebody who had a fibroma, and we managed to find information which talks about the fact that he was a shepherd, and he lived in high country. He was often out in all weathers. His house was damp, and because he was out with his sheep a lot, he would often go for extended period of time without food. And these are things that he's told the doctor and that are coming down from us, that we can,
Wow.
you can just get that kind of, just imagine the hardness of that life, that this isn't, somebody who's having an easy time of it, but who seems content with what they're doing. They're not feeling like, that they shouldn't be doing these things. So that you're getting these kind of stories of people, and in some ways it's a very mundane life, but that doesn't mean to say it's not important to think about.
Well, it's obviously evocative. I mean, it's evocative, isn't it? You sort of have these, all of a sudden when you were telling this story, I was thinking of this shepherd in the mountains of Scotland, and it's definitely evocative. I mean, I think that's the thing that I find, people think of dead bodies as these kind of, well, just a dead body, but in fact, dead bodies are extraordinarily active and alive in so many ways.
Yeah, it's true. That the thing about human remains is that they were once part of a person, and that's important. That everyone is important somehow. And the fact that we can kind of meet them almost through this small part of them is an extraordinary thing, and it's a huge privilege for me to be able to do that.
I mean, anatomists all sort of specialize in different areas and have their different interests. I mean, is there a particular part of the body that you find yourself sort of drawn to?
Less a particular part of the body. I mean, you mentioned syphilis before. I find syphilis endlessly fascinating, just because of the devastating effects that it has on the body. Working with pathological collections from the 19th century in various museums, you can't help but come across it because, it's everywhere. So I always find that really, really interesting. Just, who was suffering from this, and how are we seeing it, how is it representing? You also see in terms of human remains a huge amount of class prejudice. So for example, we have somebody who is described as having a woman with a dissolute lifestyle. She drank a little bit too much, and they were convinced that she must have syphilis. And it turned out that that was not what her problem was when they examined her post-mortem. And they seemed aghast at this, but surely, look at her, look, it should have been syphilis. Whereas we have some remains from an upper class woman who, through her lifetime, she's got consumption, she's got tuberculosis, but it turned out to be syphilis, which, a lot of women would have because their husbands would, go out and do something and bring it home. But women of that class didn't have syphilis. So,
Mm.
seeing those kind of things really, really playing out through reports is, again, very, very interesting, horrible. Um, you know, seeing through history the huge levels of misogyny like that going on. Again, it's one of the things that, while it's not nice history, and the people who end up in collections like ours tended not to be having good days. It's not nice history, but that doesn't mean to say it's not important history.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's something that I felt quite moved and sad a lot is that when I went to collections, I saw some things that, I just sort of thought no one's going to advocate for, like in Melbourne, there's a young girl. It's kind of quite a full-on prosection of a young girl who was, you know, pregnant, and she was, probably about 13, or like quite young and very small, obviously because of malnourishment. And her, she's cut in half, and they, at the time when they did the dissection or the prosection, they wrote a lot about it. And I just sort of thought no one's ever going to advocate for her, or, because there are a lot of issues now around, who is in collections and body parts. And it is usually the poor, isn't it? It sort of tells a story about how medicine used to operate. So it's I think that's the thing that I found so fascinating working on the story, was just the politics as well, isn't it? Like, you think that anatomy, you just cut up a body, you have a look inside, and there's the heart, and but my gosh, it's not that, is it? It's anatomy has a long political history.
Yeah, yeah, it really, really does. And I mean, if you go back to the early 19th century in Britain, and we get the 1832 Anatomy Act coming in, and they tried to put that through, in the 1820s, but it didn't go through Parliament. And the reason why the anatomists of the time were so determined to try and get this through Parliament was because they were having to use body snatchers to get the bodies, and that was expensive. And that meant that, I mean, first of all, they were in a profession that was being tied to criminality, and the legitimate source of bodies was hanged criminals. They were being associated with these things that the public disapproved of. But it also meant the fact that, because in France they didn't have to rely on body snatchers, they could get bodies that were unclaimed, as we would do after the 1832 Anatomy Act. It was cheaper to go to France to study anatomy. So it was making anatomy in Britain basically just not financially viable. So, they were trying to get this through largely for financial reasons, which again is really, really interesting. Like you kind of think that capitalist mentality shouldn't come into this, but of course it does.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there's I read this great line in one of the many academic papers. I think it was talking about America at the time, at the medical school in the 1800s. It was BYO body.
Yeah, yeah. I think,
Like, you literally had to find a body and bring it to medical school. And I think that's the
yeah,
thing, isn't it, is that, you've got anatomists, or even today, I mean, anatomists all around the world, even though, you're in Scotland and I'm in Australia, and we've got, very highly ethical, it's all consent. In most parts of the world, it just doesn't work this way. It's still, unclaimed bodies, or bodies shipped in from America or India. I mean, there's still a flourishing body trade in a way, but it is kind of incredible that the unclaimed bodies from mental hospitals is still a thing.
well, I mean, thankfully not in the UK anymore, but yeah, like you say, other places it's still very, very different. And yeah, we hope that we've came a bit further, but I think there are still, shall we say, ethical quandaries sometimes.
I mean, can you talk a little bit? I mean, it's quite incredible in your career. You probably have seen this sort of slow shift now about collections and people asking questions about what's in the collection and what the public can and can't see. I mean, you've got the across the world, they're like, for example, at Sydney University recently, they had Egyptian mummies that and they had a foot and a head that they've taken off display. I mean, where do you have a take on it? I have mixed feelings on this. I think it's a little bit paternalistic, and I think that people are interested in seeing inside our bodies, but it's a very fascinating and complex debate, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's incredibly complicated. And like you, I mean, I have huge problems with um the sort of gatekeeping mentality that only, you know, only if you're a medic do you have the capability of looking at this and understanding this. And I think that is completely untrue. And I think there is huge value in people who are not, you know, medically trained being able to have access to understand the insides of their body. I mean, you've got to think the fact that this is a space inside of us, you know, how close this is to us, how essential it is to everything we do, you know, how this chemical soup that's inside us, you know, makes our personality, makes me be able to have this conversation with you today. But we don't see it largely, you know, unless you're in certain professions, it's utterly unknown to us apart from through, you know, certain books where you might be able to see pictures and collections like ours. And I think that that is incredibly important. That said, we do have to acknowledge the fact that there has been a whole ethical quagmire with the way that these kind of collections have been put together, and particularly with regards to, you know, in the UK, our colonial legacy, you know, the fact that we were taking remains from outside of, you know, our own societies, and a lot of collections are doing things to try and address this. I mean, we have repatriated some of the remains that came to us through the colonial legacy, and we are still working on that. You know, this is still an ongoing process. For me, I think it's very important that we are respecting the feeling of living descendants, and we, as a museum, will always, you know, if somebody who does have descendants from from the people in our collection who do have interest in having those remains returned to us, this is something that we will facilitate if we can. And I think that's really important, because I think it's the living to whom the dead body is important, you know, and I think that always has to be respected. But we still have, that doesn't mean to say that the remains aren't valuable, you know, both in terms of the stories we can tell about the people. And I think part of the respect that we give the remains in our collection is trying to understand them as people. But I also think that in terms of the way they can help us understand ourselves is very important. You know, it's one of the, a medical museum is one of the safe spaces where you can come and think about your own mortality and think about death in a way that's very different from, you know, even public spaces like graveyards. I think this is somewhere where you get, to use a terrible term, sort of very visceral sort of reaction to our own mortality. So I think that this is one of the many things that medical museums can do, as well as educate about bodies and illness and medical history. And this is one of those things that I have so many thoughts about that, you know, trying to get them all into a little conversation like this never ever happens. So, you know, this is just kind of a tip of the iceberg of the things that I'm sort of thinking about in terms of the medical, the way we approach the human remains in our museums. But yes, it is always going to be a question that we have to reassess. You know, there isn't one answer for the whole of a collection. There isn't one answer that is going to be applicable over all time. You know, the way we change as a society is always going to change the way we think about collections like this. So it's a constant reassessment. I hope that makes sense. I feel like that's just a vomiting of
I mean,
in my head.
like I was thinking about lots of you know, lots of interjections, but you know, it's interesting, like Gunther van Hagens, I suppose, who's a very famous, you know, embalmer and plastination. His wife gave a really fascinating interview, like in the, I don't know, early 2000s, when Body Worlds was sort of starting. And she talked about how, people have always had this idea of anatomy as being really gross and in the basement and the inside of bodies from Hollywood horror films. And she was sort of saying they wanted to bring the body out of the ivory tower to the people, because for so long, it is the medical establishment that has controlled, who gets to see inside the human body. And I thought that was a really interesting point about, bringing it down from the ivory tower and showing. I mean, in
Yeah.
Australia, unfortunately, we don't really have medical museums like you do in the UK. And strangely enough, I would say that the British, they people say that there is a real death denial culture in Anglo culture, etc. But I'd say that the British are probably a bit more, and the Scottish are probably a bit more open about it, and maybe, can joke it about it more, or maybe can handle it more. Like, I think the British kind of like maybe weird things a bit more. I don't know. Like, it just seems that you have much
Um,
of a openness in the culture to have these sort of museums, because it is a bit of a thing in the UK, isn't it?
I'm not sure about a thing. I mean, in terms of public
Oh, but you do. You have
museum,
like these big famous medical museums. Like, not many countries
yeah,
in the world, I think, have medical museums like you do.
yeah. But I mean, if really, there's not many which are fully public, like we are,
Yeah.
like the
Mhm.
Anterior Museum in London. So, it is still limited where you can see this without being part of a medical community. Most of the medical collections are still fairly shut off. They tend to be associated with university collections. But that said, I mean, there is a fascination. The fact that, I mean, we got 110,000 visitors last year, which, for a private museum associated with a surgical college, is quite good, where it's a lot of visitors. So people do have that interest. And it's really interesting. I mean, one of the things that I'm doing this week is I'm giving a talk at a conference where I'm going to be talking about the public museums of the 19th century, where they did tend to be more like Gunther von Hagen's Body Worlds, these very, very public museums outside of the medical sphere, where people could go and see these kind of medical collections and have lectures and have this, which, as a sort of very, very public thing. And it was actually the Indecent Publications Act of 1857, which ends up shutting a lot of these museums down and moving it back into the sphere of medical museums like ours.
Actually, I was going to ask a technical question. I mean, ethics gets a bit hard, doesn't it, after a while? Like, we could probably talk about this for hours about, things behind closed doors. I mean, with the fluid that you use, like, you obviously, I mean, one of the things that when I was researching the book, I was surprised. I thought I was just, going to be looking at my grandparents getting chopped up. I didn't realize that there was this whole world of embalming fluid. Like,
Yeah,
it's extraordinary, isn't it? And just the history of embalming, like, for thousands of years,
yeah.
humans have been trying to keep flesh, like, to study for, all sorts of ceremonial reasons. I mean, where are you at with fluid? Do you have a particular mix? Can you talk about it? That's the other thing I found interesting, is that some anatomists and embalmers, like, didn't really like talking about their mix.
Oh yeah. I mean, anatomists like to be secretive about exactly what they were doing. Yeah. So I mean, what I'm trying to do is use the same or similar to what the preservation method already is. So, for example, a lot of the time that's something that's alcohol based. So we use a lot of alcohol, and the college actually had a license for producing alcohol in the 19th century for exactly that reason. Um, and sometimes it's a glycerol based substance, sometimes it's a weird variety of oils. We get things in oil of turpentine or cedar oil of wintergreen. and a whole range of other things that get used. So what I'm trying to do is kind of replicate the way it's already been done, unless there was
Okay.
some reason not to do that. You know, for example, um, the one that I always get asked about is formaldehyde. Everyone assumes that everything is in formaldehyde, and rarely it is. You know, we don't tend to keep things in formaldehyde because it's nasty. You know,
Mm,
it's horrible to
yeah.
work with. It's incredibly dangerous. You know, you wouldn't want a public display, you know, museum display to suddenly have something leak with formaldehyde in, because that's going to cause a massive issue. So anything that we do find that's in formaldehyde, and I mean, I think in 9 years now of opening jars at Surgeons Hall, I've came across 2 things that were in formaldehyde. And at that point, I would move it into something which was a preservative fluid, probably glycerol based rather than a fixative fluid like formaldehyde is.
Yeah, and I always find it interesting too, like when, the museums that I've been to, they'll take me out the back to a storage room and there's just hundreds of jars with bits of, and there's always the fat floating up the top and the liquid sort of dropped a bit, and the poor curator's like, oh God, I've got to fix all these jars. There's so much upkeeping, isn't it? Sort of like a lot of maintenance
Yeah,
in these museums, isn't it?
yeah. In Edinburgh, we have a sort of saying that it's, you know, it's like painting the Forth Bridge, because we've got this huge mile-long bridge, you know, going over to Fife, and it's red. And I think they've sorted the type of paint they use now, but it was always the thing. There'd always be like workers going along painting it, but by the time they get to the other side, they've got to go back and start again. So it's that kind of constant task that needs to be maintained. And of course, depending on the type of tissue, you know, you mentioned fat floating in fluid. Some tissue is fattier than others, you know, depending on what part of the body you're preserving. So, you know, the type of tissue that you're looking at has, you know, often will have its own issues when it comes to preservation.
I mean, do you have anything in your collection that's sort of really quite unusual? Or, I mean, I think that's the one thing that I find really fascinating, is that we have this perception that, on the outside we're all different, but on the inside we're the same. You know how we have this sort of cliche, oh, we're all the same on the
No.
inside. But my gosh, anatomically, no, we're not. There's so much
Yeah,
variation. And I mean, I spoke to one anatomist in Germany who, they had a body that had 2 hearts, like it is really incredible, the variations. I mean, is there a variation that you've seen that you're like, oh wow?
yeah. I mean, there's so many. I mean,
Mm.
we don't have one in our collection, but I mean, we were talking earlier about the collection in Vienna, and they have a cetus inversus, where all organs of the body are the other way around. You know, it's sort of like a mirror image of where, you know, left and right. Um, you know, that there are so many things that just go, you know, a bit differently. You know, there is no such thing as normal anatomy. You know, I mean, I personally know that one of my kidneys has 2 ureters coming out of it. So, you know, we do tend to have things like, you know, things going wrong that, you know, unless you have investigations, you're never going to know about. We have quite a lot here of what are known as horseshoe kidneys, where effectively, rather than having the 2 kidneys in your back, you had the kidneys are fused and they form a horseshoe shape that just kind of
Mm.
sits there. It doesn't quite get as far up your body as it should. So there are a whole array of different things that can happen in the body that, you know, they might cause you problems, they might not cause you problems.
I mean, it's curious, isn't it? The human variation, because I think it's sort of it is actually kind of quite significant, because it's like why surgical problems happen, isn't it? Like, I mean,
Yeah, yeah. And
like
it's one of the
following the
reasons
textbook.
why, yeah, why doing lots of dissection, why you know, using these bodies has been so important, particularly historically, before, you know, you could see a lot of photographs and things like that to try and get a handle on what might be going on. You know, if you kind of go back to the beginning of the 19th century and you're carrying out surgery, you know, you're wanting to make sure that you've experienced as many different ways that the body might be put together, so that, you know your way around if something happens to be a bit different to normal.
And I mean, do you like dissecting?
I haven't done, you know, dissection from the point of view of exploring the body since I was a student. And, I did a lot of it in terms of removing body parts when I worked in the mortuary. But dissection itself isn't something that I tend to do on a daily basis, because I tend to be working with things that people have already dissected that have been preserved. So I used to love it, but it's not something that I get to do every day. But I do, there is something when you see something that has been very, very nicely dissected, and just the skill that must have gone into that is wonderful.
Well, because that was the thing that amazed me is I met a lot of anatomists who just love dissecting and they get lost in the
Mm,
body.
yeah,
They'll start dissecting and then they look up and 4 hours have passed, like they
yeah,
get lost inside the body because they just say it's just so interesting. And it seems at first when I heard that, I was like, oh, that's really gross. But then, the more I kind of engaged in your world, I kind of realized that the body is pretty amazing inside, isn't it?
yeah. And it is that sort of, there's something just so amazing, like the kind of like looking at it in books, as I said, it's not the same as when you're in there. And actually, like the body is, you know, it's there's squidgy bits, there's unpleasant bits, there's bits that are a bit weird. And just being able to actually get hands on and see that and go, oh, so this is the way that muscle that I've only seen in the picture actually attaches. This is the way this works. And that's
Yeah.
just fabulous to see. And I mean, even on a slightly different basis, we have a skeleton here that was prepared by the trauma workshop in Paris. And it's so beautifully articulated. And you go and you can move it so that you can see the way pronation and supination works in the arm and things like that. And just being able to see, in a non-theoretical way, how those bones move, how they relate to one another as you're doing these actions. That's the kind of thing that is so valuable when you're studying anatomy.
I mean, your Instagram and Twitter are pretty. I mean, I find them amazing. Like, because it's it's very historical, but I mean, it looks like clearly when you go on holidays, you don't go and sit by the beach in Ibiza, do you?
No, 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 that's not what we do.
What would it
Yeah.
be in holidays?
What
What
was
would,
that, sorry?
what would be a normal holiday for you in Europe?
Yeah, well, I mean, usually it's kind of a mix of you know, ossuaries, transitum, medical museums, these kind of things which are very, very connected to the body and the way we think about the body. I mean, I particularly love, I have a huge interest in religious history as well as anatomical history, and I do love the way those mesh together. And I really love the way that as you see memento mori art, this art of, contemplating your own death, which is very, very common in Christianity through the medieval period into the early modern period. The way you see the representations of that reflecting the way our anatomical understanding has changed. And, that's something that I always find so fascinating. And I'm writing about a lot just now.
Actually, I went to the 2019 big anatomical conference in London and met an anatomist and a medieval historian there that were studying the tombs where you have the normal figure, and then you have the emaciated skeleton underneath.
Yeah,
And
they're the transitombs.
tombs that were, they think that they're about purgatory. Like, why would a rich person portray themselves as this sort of like half naked, emaciated skeleton? Like it's pretty
Yeah.
extraordinary, isn't it? I can see why you
I
like.
I always think it's like the worst humble brag in the world, because it's trying to show, oh yeah, it's once we die, we're all going to be the same. This is what's going to happen to us. I am understanding that it's going to happen to me, and I'm portraying myself in this debased state because it's what I've done in life that's going to be important. But you're doing that while making a really expensive tomb that shows how rich you are.
Yeah, you're right. I hadn't thought about them as humble brags. So what have you what's on the horizon? Are you like in terms of projects, or is there anything particular that you're working on, or anything new and exciting?
Well, I'm speaking at conferences this week and next week. So this week I'm talking about public anatomy museums in the 19th century, and how they worked in Britain, what they were for, and what brought them to an end. Which is very, very related to what we were saying before about anatomy in its ivory towers. And then next week, I'm talking at the British Society for the History of Sciences about injections in anatomy. So the idea that, you can look at the body, but some of the structures in there are so small and so delicate that they're really difficult to see. So the way that you can highlight them, bring them out so that you can visualize them better to understand what's going on, is to inject something into it. So blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, these teeny tiny little structures in the body, which you could inject with maybe a dye, maybe with wax, and you get these wonderful, wonderful, they're known as corrosion casts, where blood vessels will be injected with wax, which will then harden, and then you'll use an acid to take the tissue away around it, so you're just left with the vascular framework, so you can show that.
Yeah, they're so
Beautiful.
pretty, aren't they? I love those ones.
It's so amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
doing conservation work on them is terrifying because they're so delicate and you just feel like you can't breathe, but they are beautiful. And then you get ones which have been injected with mercury, which is, some of them just look like jewelry. You just see these beautiful silver tracings through the tissue. We have one here, and it makes me think of, you just see these silver traces through this square of tissue from the groin, and it makes me think of when you look out of a plane and see a city at night.
I wonder how in 100 years' time the conservators will look at your work. Like, it'll be interesting, won't it? Do you get the opportunity to, get a foot from the hospital and preserve it?
We don't tend to, in terms of human remains, we're a closed collection.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
unless there's very, very exceptional circumstances, we don't take new human remains in. We did have an exception to that. When was it? 2022, when we had a woman who, I don't know if you've heard about this in Australia, transvaginal mesh.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's something that's was being used commonly to help women after pregnancy. It ends up causing a hell of a lot of problems for a lot of women. They're now no longer used in the UK. And we had a woman who was having her mesh removed, who got in touch with us, who wanted to be able to give it to us so that we could tell her story, so that people would understand why these things caused problems. So she gave that to us after surgery in April 2022. And because it's not just the mesh, the mesh as it's taken out has brought a layer of tissue that was literally enmeshed in the mesh. So that's preserved in the same way that we have preserved the things historically. So that is something that has been preserved from first principles.
Actually, when I was in Vienna, the curator was waiting on some COVID lungs. He like you, a lot of these museums are closed now and the thing is, because other collections shut down, so he got given, he's just got too much stuff. But he said he was open to COVID lungs. Have you got COVID lungs, or?
We don't have COVID lungs. It would be a nice thing to be able to have. And again, because, one of the things that we're doing a lot more now is genetic research. That a collection like this is a huge bank of genetic knowledge. And the thing that most scientists are finding interesting is actually the genetics of the pathogens. So we have a lot of testing being done looking at viral DNA, viral RNA, bacterial DNA, to try and understand how these pathogens evolve. And again, coming out of COVID, understanding how a virus might evolve and how it might change, we can see how that would be a bit important to our future potentially.
Wow, I feel like I could talk to you for hours. It's fantastic. So look, thank you so much for your time. And yeah, I hopefully we can meet up one day.
Yeah, that would be
Maybe we can go
amazing.
check out some bones.
I'm always up for looking at bones.